In this proof, I want to demonstrate the most basic tactic for using IP. For an explanation of why IP is justified or the concepts behind it, make sure to refer to either the textbook or this week's slideshow, and also refer to the textbook or this week's slideshow on a deeper look at the restrictions and permissions of rule IP and subproofs. Rule IP is an incredibly powerful rule. In fact, every single valid argument can be proven using rule IP. There's no other rule that we can say that with. However, using rule IP is not always the easiest way to prove a valid argument. The indication that IP is going to be fairly straightforward is mainly just when your desired conclusion, whether the conclusion of the argument or an intermediate conclusion, is something whose opposite is easy to work with. That is to say, here we're trying to derive tilde A. Tilde A's opposite is just the sentence letter A, and A is really easy to work with. And in fact, in terms of ingredients that we might want, A is something that is immediately productive. We can use it with modus ponens on line 1 and again modus ponens on line 2. So whenever you have a sentence whose opposite is easy to work with, that's the sign that IP will probably be a pretty straightforward or easy way to go. So if we're going to use rule IP, the way that we do it is we have to open a subproof and assume the opposite of whatever it is that we want to prove. And so if we want to prove tilde A, we assume A. If we want to prove, suppose we're in a different argument and we wanted to prove B, right, suppose that was our conclusion, and we wanted to use IP, our assumption for IP would be tilde B. And for that matter, suppose we wanted to prove a more complex sentence like G or R, the assumption for IP would be the negation of the entire conclusion. We justify that assumption as such, and I always recommend, to help you keep track of what you're doing, is that what you are trying to derive then is a self-contradiction. We have indented here because we are helping ourselves to the sentence A. We have not derived it, nor has it been given to us as a premise. Instead, we are just assuming it. And as you've seen me mention elsewhere, indenting is usually good enough. But as you'll see in the textbook and a lot of my answer keys, and I encourage it in your own work too, to help you really visualize the fact that you're in that you have opened up a subproof, is you can also drop a vertical line. Once we've done that, the proof proceeds as normal. And here in this proof, I'm going to demonstrate the working forwards or working from the lines that you already have strategy. For all proofs, you just want to take stock, but certainly for working forwards, you have to. And all you're doing here is looking for matching rule patterns and trying to anticipate which of those matching rule patterns is going to generate further lines that's going to be productive. And certainly, as we noted before, the assumption of A leads immediately to modus ponens on lines 1 and 4 to get B, as well as modus ponens on, 2 and 4 to derive C. Even if it's not super clear before you actually derive these further lines, remember that because we're in an IP proof, we are looking for any self-contradiction. And think about what we have so far. At lines 5 and 6, we're being told that B is happening and that C is happening. And at line 3, we're being told that at least one of them doesn't happen, right? But we've just been told in lines 5 and 6 that B and C both happen, but line 3 is telling us that at least one of them doesn't happen. We actually have our contradiction already. Of course, it doesn't look like a contradiction, and so for rule IP, it doesn't count, okay? But this is the tactical clue. Whenever we have more or less what we want, but it's not in the right expression, we can look to replacement rules. And of course here, the natural replacement rule to look at, because we have a combination of tildes and wedges, is De Morgans. So if we De Morgansed line 3, okay, and conjed lines 5 and 6, then we'd have our self-contradiction in lines 7 and 8 conj. At the start of your subproof, you're never going to know how long it is. And here I've made my line too long, no big deal, I just erase it. Or you can just write underneath it. But the point is, as soon as we've gotten our self-contradiction, which we have derived at line 9, then I'm entitled to close my subproof. So I unindent. And the way that I close my subproof is whatever my first line was. In this case, it's just the sentence letter A, but whatever that opening assumption was, I stick a tilde in front of it and write that line down again. And my justification is the whole subproof, so this is going to be 4 through 9 using indirect proof, or IP. Now, before I move on here, I wanted to point out that you should try as much as possible to keep an open mind about the contradiction that you're going to generate, because in most proofs you can actually generate more than one self-contradiction. For example, here in sort of thinking through or working forwards, I think this was the more obvious contradiction to derive, but certainly there are others. For example, maybe what you saw instead was that if we double negated line 5, then we could derive not C using 3 and 7 ds. And then we've got this contradiction. This is 6 and 8 conj. And again, it doesn't matter what the self-contradiction is as long as we get to one. Once we've got one, we close the proof the same way. We stick a tilde in front of whatever our first line was, and we cite the whole subproof and indirect proof. I point this out here only because there's often a mistake that beginning IP users use, which is that they think the contradiction has to be with the assumption. We're just looking for any contradiction whatsoever, and again, oftentimes there's actually more than one contradiction that you'll be able to derive. Last comment on this particular argument. This argument can be proven directly, that is to say without appeal to subproofs. The most straightforwardly use implication twice, and then use conjunction, and then use constructive dilemma, and then use tautology. I'll put that in the description just for those of you that are interested, but for anyone looking for a little bit more practice, do that proof, prove this argument, except without subproofs, and see what you come up with.